The Next Level Casino Careers Show, a series highlighting industry tips and insights from the best minds in the casino and hospitality industry. Enjoy the show.
Dr. Stephen Lynn, how are you doing today?
Doing quite well. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. First, I want to just thank you for joining us today. You're a busy individual, a consultant. I want to make sure I get this right. A consultant, an author, an associate professor of business communications at USC Marshall School of Business. You came and spoke to Sam Manuel, our group, a couple weeks ago. And I was like, man, we got to have this guy on the podcast, because if we're all about trying to help people in their career beyond Sam Manuel, just in our industry, your insight is very valuable with all the things that you kind of touched from a communication angle. So just to start, thanks for joining.
Oh, thanks for having me. It was fantastic working with your group. And the mission you just laid out for the podcast and for your work is really at the heart of what I do. I really find it intrinsically motivating to empower others. It's why I love being a consultant, why I love being a professor. So this is a treat for me.
Yeah, and that's why it's so great to work for this organization, the Tribe, because it's just so ingrained to, as I say, spread knowledge, seek knowledge. And that's what this platform is all about, really helping people in our industry. So to get started, we always like to start with the 3-minute origin story to provide better context on who the featured speaker is, their expertise. So I know it's hard to narrow it down to 3 minutes, but if you wouldn't mind taking a stab at connecting the audience with who you are and ultimately what led you to what you do today.
Sure. I am an inherently curious person. That is part of who I am. And I think it really is something that's been there since childhood for me. I grew up on a dirt road in the sticks of Michigan, but I had the really wonderful opportunity to travel with my father, who has an insurance agency and financial planning business. And especially when I was younger, he was traveling the world working with clients, and I got the chance to go along with him a good number of times. And then during the summer, I'd park my bike in the back of his office. So I got a chance to see both small business and global business really from childhood. And that has made me really appreciate what it is to do business. And he worked with so many interesting projects that I think that helped really push me to become even more of a curious person. And I didn't really see that as having any career future for me. Sorry, Dad, but I was not interested in taking over the insurance business. I don't think I realized till probably way later than I could have that communication work and communication work for businesses really just fit me and was something that was fun and I was decently good at. And so I think we joke a lot in my family that I've accidentally become my father in a lot of ways. Now that I get to travel and work with clients and work with students and go visit that dirt road back home a couple times a year.
Thanks. So I want to understand, you said curious, travel with your father, but one thing I try to always understand is, like, to me, communications is something, and you can agree or disagree here. Curious to know your take. I feel like it's something you never master and you always have to work at it. But for you, as far as a career, kind of where did you get your early chops and kind of a root fundamental, so to speak, in communication? Kind of like, what was the early point in your career, or maybe as a child, where you really started to develop those skills and then the light bulb go off and maybe I want to make a career out of this?
There was a moment when I was the scene when I was 12 years old. I got off the school bus at my grandma's house. She lived down the road. We would often stay with her after school till my parents got home. And I was reading the comic book series Spider-Man 2099. If anybody has seen the most recent Spider-Verse movie, they've probably seen the Miguel O'Hara character. Well, that character had its own comic book run in the 90s. And I got off the school bus one afternoon and I was quite intent on writing a letter to the fan letter portion of the comic book. In the back of the comic book was a section called Arachnophilia. It was fan letters. And I sat down at the typewriter in my grandma's little home office and I started typing out this letter with the intent of getting it published. And so I was really strategic as this 12-year-old comic book fan. I went through the title page with all the different artists and authors listed, and I mentioned each of them by name and praised them for their great work. And then I lobbed my criticism across the typewriter because something that happened in issue 31 just didn't make sense to me. And I then added another piece of praise, and I wanted to use the sentence 2 out of 3. Now, the way that I typically heard it was 2 out of 3 ain't bad. But 12-year-old me, who was a good student, read a lot, would never use the word ain't. And so I thought, well, I should write 2 out of 3 isn't bad. But then I thought the comic book editors probably want to publish letters from the average Joe. And the average Joe says ain't. So I typed out on my typewriter, 2 out of 3 ain't bad. And the letter got published. It got published in the back of the comic book. And to this day, I do not know if I could have had that letter published without the use of the word ain't. That moment, that letter, is a great joy and a great haunting question for me. That was probably a really early moment for me, where my brain started to put the pieces together that this communication thing is something that my brain is tuned to, maybe a little bit more acutely than the average bear. That thinking through as a 12-year-old, should I type ain't, should I type isn't, was probably one of the earliest markers of where my career would go and the skills I'd develop.
So from there, that foundation, did your foundation kind of begin with writing as a forms of communication, or kind of connect the dots of understanding you were very curious? You had a level up from just being around your dad and watching him communicate as part of the insurance business, but kind of take us to college and beyond. Kind of where did your career go from there, and where did you kind of lay down your fundamental chops for communications from that period?
A big turning point for me was joining the debate team in college. I didn't really know what a debate team was. I just knew that like the academic kids were joining debate. I got a letter in the mail saying I should join debate. And so I figured, okay, I don't know what this really is, but I joined it, and it was a really great education in thinking through constructing a sound argument and telling it as a story to somebody who hasn't heard it before, but that you're really trying to convince. So we were explicitly trained in quality research, in checking your own bias, and especially in understanding what does somebody else need to hear for you to convince them. And that was really a really powerful part of my education. I also ended up majoring in communication studies, not because I had a career path in mind, but because I knew that whatever I eventually switched my major into, all of the communication classes would still be relevant. All of the communication stuff I'd be learning would be relevant and important in any career field. But I the communication studies program. Fast forward a few years later, when I was finishing up my PhD, there was a business school that was interested in somebody helping their students develop sound arguments, helping their students learn how to craft a story of a successful business and tell it to various stakeholders. And that opportunity came my way, and my debate background, my communication background, and as it turned out, my background of parking my bike in my dad's small business all kind of added up to a really cool opportunity to join the world of business communication formally.
Okay, so early in your career, because this is a good kind of place to start as well, is that first job. Just kind of, if you wouldn't mind, connect the dots from how you graduated, and then kind of what were the major stops along the way to ultimately what you do now, which is teach.
I finished my master's degree in speech communication from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and I had no idea what I wanted to do. I mean, even after getting my master's degree, I still didn't know. So I applied to every job I could find, from a coffee runner at the UN embassy in Nairobi to an assistant at the Jim Henson Company, and I got a very, very long string of no's. And I don't think I was channeling 12-year-old me when I was writing those application letters, because I was simply copying and pasting. I wasn't thinking through who my audience was. I wasn't thinking through what was unique about this moment that I could leverage. I was simply thinking, I don't know, it's a numbers game, right? Toss them all out there to anybody who has an email address. And that did not work for me. That did not work at all. But as it turned out, it was somebody who I had a networked relationship with that reached out to me unexpectedly through Facebook, of all places, and said, I'm so sorry to offer you this over Facebook. I just don't know how else to contact you, but we have a teaching position open, and I know you taught some during your master's program. Would you be interested? It's last minute. Would you be interested in stepping into this role? I hadn't quite thought about being a professor as a career, and I still had only achieved my master's degree at that point. But I said, sure, absolutely. Kermit the Frog wasn't calling, so I guess we'll take this opportunity. And I loved it. I absolutely loved it. It allowed me to approach communication questions that are really dynamic in a foundational yet ever-changing way. And it allowed me to really help students to see their potential and to grow. Meanwhile, on the side, I was occasionally doing some freelance work for clients, and still working with my father on occasion when he had a project that needed a communication thing made. And so on the side, I had a small percolating consulting business while I was dipping my toes into communication education. And I loved it. And so I figured, if we're going to do this, let's do it the full way. Ended up going back to get my PhD. And that really paved the way for some really, really amazing opportunities that I'm really, really grateful for.
So life's work and PhD in communications. I'm going to ask you to fill in the blank here, and then we'll kind of expand upon it. But of all the students or all the questions you get, if you were to fill out this question that I'm going to ask, how would you fill it out? And that question would be this line: the one thing that most people struggle with when it comes to communication is blank.
That's a great question. I confront all sorts of macro and micro challenges with clients and with students. The overarching challenge that is really key to overcoming, to unlocking all sorts of potential, is giving yourself permission. So many speakers and content creators have not yet given themselves permission to be a bigger, fuller, more strategic version of themselves. Oftentimes, for example, I'll have a client or a student who wants to create a slide deck that is really simple, or they want to just get up and read a bullet list of facts. And so I have to really try to encourage them to think about the other tactics they have to meet their moment. And they'll occasionally respond with something like, I'm just a data person. I don't want to get all into that storytelling stuff, or I don't want to work on my delivery because it doesn't matter. It's just the facts that matter. Oftentimes at the root of that is an anxiety over giving themselves permission. They have found comfort in data points, but they have not found comfort in giving themselves permission to explore in a really vulnerable way what it might mean to be a bigger, more strategic, more tactical, communicative version of themselves. And when we can unlock that permission to say, okay, we can do more things. You're going to fail at some of them a few times as you're learning them, and that's good. That's part of the process. But give yourself permission to go there and to try something new, to think about it from a new angle. That's really the key to so much communication success.
I love that. Give yourself permission. And I find that a lot too, is people kind of use, whether it's data as a crutch, or even when they're putting together slides, as you explained, they'll put just a lot up there so that when they go up, they don't really have to craft a story. And I really want to speak for the introverts and people who just don't like it at all, but still want to be successful in their career. So I guess kind of what are some early tips, or maybe some things that you would provide of guidance of, let's just take there's somebody like a manager, or maybe a first-time director, or somebody who's has a big presentation coming up, or they know they got to present more than they're used to. what kind of tips would you provide for them to start to get better at that? Would it be simply to give yourself permission? And if so, what does that look like if maybe I have a big presentation that I'm going to present to the leadership group in a month? Kind of what are some practical tips to help get them on the right path so that maybe that presentation isn't so daunting and maybe they can have some success with it?
Presentations is probably the most frequent part of my courses that we end up working on. It is probably the sweet spot of a lot of the syllabi and curricula that are passed my way or that I create. And it can be really challenging for individuals who are introverted or nervous or shy. I myself am one of those introverted people. The difference between being an introverted person who is successful at a presentation and an introverted person who just runs away from the presentation is learning the tactics that can bring down some of your anxiety or that can minimize the burden of presenting. Sometimes people who are introverted suffer from a higher level of anxiety. Sometimes they don't. It's just draining. It's just draining to get up and to share with others. So part of the practice is to do some self-reflection to determine what it is you don't love about that moment so that you can bring down its effects a little bit. And then there are some tactical choices or tactical tips that can help you improve the success of your presentation, like preparation, for example. It seems trite to say you need to prepare, but it is so critical to being successful. I explain it this way. Let's say you're introverted and you don't love the fact that you've been asked to give a presentation to the board. Well, let's say you did that presentation and then the boss came to you and said, "That was great. Can you give that same presentation to our investors?" And you say, "I don't want to, but okay, sure." And you do it, it goes well. And then your supervisor in your unit comes to you and says, "Oh, that's great. Can we have that for your colleagues on your team as well?" And you say, "Fine, sure." You may not have loved it, but by the third time you've given that presentation, it's going to feel like such a lower weight. And you're going to be better at hitting your high notes. You're going to be better at landing those complicated intricacies that were maybe fumbled a little bit the first time. We know that's true. We know that's true for extroverts and introverts and everybody in between. So if we prepare strategically, then we can create that success for ourselves. Very specifically, in terms of giving yourself permission, one of the ways I suggest preparing is to prepare in front of real faces, or at least fake faces. So maybe you need to get your, I don't know, your stuffed animals or your, I don't know, Backstreet Boys poster, I don't know what it is, in front of you so you've got real eyes, or at least simulated eyes to look into. Or my dog just walked past me, and he's actually a great speaking tool because some folks find success in practicing giving their presentation to their pet. They may not feel comfortable yet giving the presentation in front of real people, but maybe you can give yourself permission to give it to your dog. Or then you can level up and bribe a couple friends with pizza, practice once or twice in front of some real people, even though it doesn't feel comfortable and you would rather just avoid and wait to the last minute. Procrastination is typically not the result of laziness. Procrastination is emotional deference, that there's a thing that is going to be taxing and you don't want to do it, and so you wait and wait and wait. We do that with permission. We do that with presentations a lot. But if you can give yourself permission to go through the unfun, uncomfortable practice presenting to your friends, the success rate skyrockets and the toll it takes on you really starts to diminish.
Oh, for sure. And I have found it, we've talked about this before, but naturally growth comes from being uncomfortable.
Mhm.
So as a speaker, as a communicator, you're going to have to feel uncomfortable for a while to really, just like anybody who works out or is a long distance runner, right? Like you always start from like a baseline and you run, or if it's lifting, for example, you do it to failure, but then over time it gets easier and that's how you grow. And I think the same kind of reps mentality applies to communication. And I love that you hit on that because that's something, at least for me personally speaking, I was lucky enough early in my career, I had the opportunity, I pitched an idea about pitching in for new hire orientation. So every single week I could do a 10-minute spiel on marketing and what the role is and what are the differences between the properties. And I found that was so beneficial because I got to practice every single week. And even though it was the same topic, so after a while, I really wasn't pressing myself, but it allowed me to kind of find my voice in a presentation, find where to riff, find where to like structurally put things. So I guess the question to you is would you find that a benefit? Because I know speaking to, even if you have to do it to yourself, to your dogs, but like trying to give people the opportunity to find practical tips, would you recommend like somebody trying to find somewhere where they can practice regularly? We had a previous leader said that he found practice within church and, speaking in front of the church. So I guess to me, I think it's so much more impactful if you can find somewhere early to get those reps in. Does that make sense?
It absolutely does. And that's such a great suggestion. When we know this works from stand-up comedians, they will workshop material, sure, in their own head, on the train, while they're waiting for their Starbucks, but they really get the most value out of workshopping their material on the road. And that's going to require that their jokes don't land perfectly the first time for a lot of the jokes, but they workshop them by going from town to town, or they keep going back to that open mic night and they try out the joke, they refine it, they toss some of them because they don't work. I've had to toss a good number of jokes or even pieces of advice in my class over the years because they don't always stand up to the progression of time, and that is really, really valuable. One of the best ways you can grow is by putting yourself out there, by volunteering to lead the meeting, by asking your supervisor if there can be opportunities for you to speak, by testing out that material on whatever the version of the road is for you.
And you provided some good insights when you're. So let's take a practical example. Let's say I'm presenting in 5 minutes, and we know those people out there who are just internally freaking out. Like the heart beats through the roof. They feel fuzzy. I've had people say that they literally couldn't hear themselves talk. Right. So like when you're experiencing these anxiety symptoms that are over the top for people who are just really nervous, what are some practical tips? Because you provided some really good ones, I think be beneficial for this audience, for to help them regulate and calm down before they're about to do a speech or a communication.
Yeah, when you don't have time to prepare, or when your anxiety is just more chronic, we need tactics in order to help ourselves mentally and physically to deal with the very real impacts of nervousness or anxiety or just the jitters or stage fright, whatever we want to call it. One of the mental habits for content that can be really helpful for a presenter, especially when you're asked at the last minute. You're at the boardroom table and you find out that you're going to be asked to give an update, or you just get asked out of the blue that you're to give an update on your project. One of the best mental habits to give yourself a little bit of security and to trick people into thinking that you're prepared is to use structure. So when we give presentations, they tend to be the most successful when we have a clear structure, this sort of like intro, body, conclusion, or I'm going to enumerate what I'm going to tell to you in my next 30-second spiel. By using that structure, we can trick others into thinking that we've put some preparation into it, and it can give ourselves a base to feel a little bit less nervous about. And then we can also do some physiological moves. We can make some literal physiological moves that can help bring down anxiety. So one of my favorite ones is actually by taking your fingers, and anybody who is watching this, feel free to play along. You can take your fingers and press them together pretty tough, like exert some force for like an 8 count. 5, 6, 7, 8, and then let your arms drop down naturally beside you. It's not like the most relaxing, like the like sports therapy industry is not going out of business because of that move, but it does help. It does help reduce at least a little bit of tension. And the really great thing is that it redirects your mental focus to this move, which is really powerful. Another physiological move we can make is the deep breath. It also sounds trite, like just take a deep breath. Well, take the word just out of that sentence so that the sentence can retain its power. Take a deep breath. Take a couple and take them slowly. I was at an event yesterday and we had an icebreaker at the beginning of the event. I have a PhD in communication. I work with clients. I do workshops. I've done workshops all around the world. And in this icebreaker activity, we had to go around and say the weirdest food we've ever had. My heart rate elevated and I could feel my hands shaking. It's like, it's just a weird food. Nobody is going to judge me one way or the other. People before me were saying some really funny things and some really, to be honest, bland things as well. And everybody was responding perfectly nicely. So there was no pressure for me to revolutionize the conversation with some amazing story. No, I could say whatever I wanted and I knew I had a good audience. But all of a sudden, I could feel my body doing the nervousness thing. Thankfully, I am aware that sometimes my body thinks it needs to be nervous when it really doesn't. So I took a few deep breaths as the numbers were getting closer to me, and wow, it genuinely helps. It's not a perfect cure all, but it helps because it slows down your heart rate. It gives that fuel back to your brain, the oxygen it needs to start processing more normally. And again, it has me focusing on my breathing as opposed to this really amorphous fear that I have that somehow I'm going to ruin my life by saying the wrong food out loud. Deep breaths, the sort of muscle relaxer, redirecting of your attention can be a way to bring down your anxiety in the moment.
Yeah, I'd love you providing tips because you're right. People will be like, just take a breath, or just, like, don't panic, or like those are not helpful when
Just
you're
relax.
in that state of mind. It's kind of like your mind's gone. But speaking of that, I'm sure this is a hard question to answer, but where does communication anxiety, where does it root from? Is it individualized? Just broad question, take it where you want. But like, what's the source for most communication anxiety?
Anxiety in general is definitely something that we experience individually. And sometimes it's because of very real, tangible issues. In the workplace, we can experience anxiety because maybe we can't get the numbers to balance right in the books. Or maybe maybe you're in a more physical field and you just can't figure out how to turn the wrench in the right way to literally get the machine to work. Like maybe it's a really physical thing and that can be bothering you and making you nervous. Often, though, our anxiety comes from more of a social perspective internally. So, what I mean by that is oftentimes we fear that there is some sort of negative social repercussion to not doing something right. Anxiety can be understood as this general sense of uneasiness that we sometimes experience so strongly that we get paralyzed, mentally paralyzed, usually when there is something happening or about to happen that our brain is processing in a way that is often not totally rooted in the full reality of the moment. Now, sometimes it is. Maybe you've got a conversation with your boss and you're pretty sure you're getting fired. Sure, it's fair to feel anxious in that moment. Those are actually the anomalies, though. What's more common is we have this perception in a really vague way in our mind that we are at risk somehow. And the human mind is wired, and then the human body is wired to be really risk averse. That's a good thing. It's a good thing because when I'm walking across the street and I see a car barreling down too fast while the crosswalk sign is on, I don't want to sit and have a theoretical discussion about what should I do with my life? Should I have a conversation about the proper place of me in the city in this moment in time? No, 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 no. I want my body to just get me off that road so that I can be safe. That's great. We literally have a part of our brain, the amygdala, that helps generate those mental impulses and release hormones to allow our body to make some of those instantaneous fight or flight reactions. The problem is that we interpret too much of our daily lives as a fight or flight moment. You get asked in an icebreaker scenario, what's the weirdest food you've ever had? And my brain thinks fight or flight, gotta run, gotta, this isn't gonna work out for me. And that understanding is really critical to help developing personal and kind of universal tactics to help deal with that communication anxiety. If, for example, I can give some daylight to why I'm so nervous about saying something out loud in front of my colleagues, or if I can explain in a logical, put it all on paper fashion why I don't want to be called on during a meeting, then oftentimes that daylight can help fade some of the anxiety at the edges, because we realize, oh, I'm experiencing anxiety for something that actually isn't risky. The actual logical worst case scenario actually isn't so bad. And then in the moments where you say, okay, talking it out doesn't totally help, then by knowing that our brain is driving so much of that communication anxiety, we can do other things to help counteract it. I like to think of it like taking the microphone away from that amygdala, that fight or flight part, taking the microphone away and handing it to another part of our brain. So another tactic you can use to make yourself more comfortable in the moment speaking at work is by doing a grounding exercise where you allow yourself, you choose to be really present physically in the moment by choosing something that is an object in the room and describing it with sensory detail. So I might say, maybe it's even something as simple as my phone. And I say, my phone is about 3 inches wide, and it has a case that is a dark green color. The texture is rough, and it has some wearing on the edges that make the dark green seem almost black. And I can describe that sensory detail. And that is useful for us because we know one of the ways anxiety works is that fight or flight gets too much attention in our brain. It's talking too loudly. So I'm going to hand the microphone to another part of my brain, the prefrontal cortex or the parietal lobe, that is in charge of maybe puzzle solving or understanding the sensory world around us. And I'm going to let it fire off in my brain. And it tends to work over and over again that amygdala is like, wait, hey, but we wanted to be nervous. Fine, never mind. And your nerves come down. That is most successful when you can practice that ahead of time, that you make that, you practice that technique. And then when you're in the moment at work where you're about to go in for an interview and you're about to walk through that door, or you're about to walk in and ask for a raise and your heart is racing, you can then start to do one of those sensory description moves, and your mind will be in the habit of saying, this is what we do to bring our nerves down. And next thing you know, you're having a more successful conversation about that raise because you're more in control of what your mind is doing.
There's so much there, and I wrote down so many good notes. I saw this funny thing the other day. It was like, anxiety is running conspiracy theories on yourself. It's like predicting this future that ultimately has not happened yet, but usually it's like the worst version of the future that's even possible. And when you talked about, I think that scenario of, because we've all experienced it, you're in a room and we're doing an icebreaker, and let's all go around and say 3 stories or 3 things about yourself that people might not know. And in my head, that narrator just goes so loud. It's like, okay, you got to pick 3 really cool things because you really want to stand out. And it's like, no, you don't. You don't want to show off. And then it's like, well, what are you going to say? And like, it just, your mind narrator goes crazy. And I say all that because I just want to share with people. I think your internal narrator a lot of times is just, to your point, way over the top, and we all have it. And I think you pointed at it so eloquently, is like, our minds are built for survival. They always have been. And then now we're living in 2023 world where we don't have saber-toothed tigers jumping out of bushes and people trying to attack us. And you know what I mean? So like, now we're applying that to so many different places where it serves us well for survival, but from a day-to-day work perspective, sometimes it's not very useful. And having practical tips to manage that, I think, is so helpful. And at least for me, something that was really beneficial is starting to realize like that internal narrator and just a little bit of mindfulness exercises and meditation to like, oh, I'm not crazy. Like the voice in my head sometimes feels crazy, but I'm not those thoughts. If I just let them run for a little bit and I could just note them, they don't really jerk me around as much as they used to, right? Like, so it's not, I just want to say to people, you're not alone. If you have anxiety, whether it's around communication or you have certain triggers, I think there's some practical tips that Dr. Stephen Lynn's hitting on that, could be really helpful. And I want to ask this question. What are your thoughts as it relates? Because when I was younger, the term anxiety, I didn't hear that a lot. Like I didn't hear to the degree now, where I'm sure if I just Googled anxiety, there's probably like 10 different articles about anxiety in 2023, more kids having anxiety. I feel like anxiety is more prevalent than ever, or maybe it just didn't have a term before. What are your thoughts as it relates to kind of the environment now and most people saying they have some form of anxiety one way or the other?
Yeah, I grew up parking my bike in the back room of the insurance agency that my father and grandfather had started. And growing up, you didn't talk about anxiety, you didn't talk about stress. Like my grandfather, who we all wonderfully loved, like he was a stern and strong and maybe even at times gruff man who also served in World War II. So like here I am saying, I'm so worried about talking about a weird food I've had. He served in World War II. I don't get to talk about anxiety. Like that's the sort of style of conversation that we had maybe 1-2 decades ago. But over the last maybe 5-10 years, we've had this real upward tick in talking about mental health and talking about well-being and wellness. And truth be told, we probably go overboard at times in talking about anxiety or talking about traumas when really we just had a bad day or somebody annoyed us. We probably do use the terms too much at times. That said, it's also a great thing that we are talking about the internal life in really robust ways now, because we have always been concerned about the physical self, of course, like exercise, going to a doctor. These are important ways of keeping your physical self healthy. It's great that we are now having a more robust conversation about keeping the internal self, the mental, psychic self healthy as well. And that's particularly valuable because so much of our workplace success is based on communication. And our physical selves, whether or not I work out, whether or not I go to the doctor, have an impact on how I communicate. Yes, that's absolutely true. But the internal, the mental self has way more impact on my communication success. So it's great that this language of anxiety, even though it has baggage, and even though my grandpa probably wouldn't have loved it, it's great that we're having this more robust conversation now, because we can level ourselves up if we identify what's happening up here, so that what happens out of our mouth is a little bit more what we want.
Yeah, absolutely. And something I circled as you were talking about like your grandpa, but I think it's true, is humility, like that, and perspective, right? So I think sometimes we get so in our own head, not to say the problems are not big, but sometimes we just over exaggerate them. For example, let's take communication, for example, or public speaking, like we've been talking about. We did this game one time. I was in this improv class for a day as a workshop, and essentially everybody had their own piece of things that they had to say, and they passed around this ball. And you didn't know the point of the exercise, but by the time you got done, it was like, okay, how many of the people do you remember what they said? And 95% of everybody, they can remember some, but where they struggled when was almost their time to speak, because they were just thinking about, okay, what am I going to say? Da, 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 da. And that was a light bulb for me, because it's most of the time people are not listening to you. I know that might be hard, but it's true. Like you could be looking at someone dead in the face and they're zoning out thinking about dinner or whatever it may be. And to me, that's gratifying as a speaker, because even if you stumble, even if you fall, they're not thinking about you. They're not. And you shouldn't be ripping and just, having that internal dialogue that's so hard on yourself. Just get better, right? But even like the worst of the worst, most of the time is not that bad. And no one's thinking about it besides you, don't you think?
I absolutely agree. We would be more effective communicators at work if we would give ourselves a little grace and let ourselves off the hook a little bit. Presenters are always the most critical of themselves. And oftentimes, the errors that they are so hung up on are things that the audience had no clue ever happened. They just miss it. I also like the suggestion for networking communication. You are at an event and maybe you're there solo, or maybe there's people you want to meet there. It can be really hard to figure out, how do I awkwardly go meet somebody? I can't just go up and talk to them. Like that, well, why not? Why not? Like, we have in our heads that for some reason, if I walk up to somebody at a holiday party, they're going to judge me for the rest of my life, and my career and my family's careers are going to be doomed, and they're going to write epic tales about how catastrophic our life was. When, just like you just described, ask yourself when the last time was somebody approached you at a party, period, let alone when was the last time somebody approached you at a work party and you couldn't believe it? That the fact that they walked towards you was just an insane choice. Of course, we don't have those thoughts, those memories, because people don't perceive our normal or even wonky, awkward actions as being all that important to them, because they too are probably a little bit preoccupied with what's going on in their own work life.
Uh, Dr. Stephen Lund, thank you for taking the time. There's one more subject I want to hit on, and then we'll have some kind of quicker questions in nature. But the other topic I really wanted to pick your brain on is dealing with difficult people. We all can experience it, right? Whether it's a loved one, it's a family member, it's a good friend, or in the workplace setting, you have to work with this person, but they're just difficult, and for whatever reason, you don't jive. But whatever the context of the difficulty is, what is your words of advice as it relates to, hey, I work with this person, or maybe I have a family member, somebody I have to interact with, but it drains me to communicate with them because they're so difficult. Any words of advice there?
Yeah, sure. I'll give you two macro suggestions and then one really micro tactical suggestion. The two broad suggestions are, first, to really deliberately, specifically think through what your goals are. When you are working with that person, what do you need to happen with that interaction, or what do you want to happen? If it's a customer or a guest, you might want loyalty. You might just want the conversation to end. You might want them to XYZ. Knowing what you want out of that specific interaction is really critical to know how you should proceed with that very specific difficult person or type of difficult person. The second broad suggestion is that active listening is really a powerful tool. Like we were just talking about, it's so common for us to not genuinely listen. Usually we're just quiet until it's our turn to make noise again. And active listening is really different than that. Active listening is the style of listening where you're almost like a detective, trying to read through the lines, trying to understand their emotional reality, trying to understand through their nonverbal behavior some of their motivations. And that can really help you understand how to work with a person differently. If, for example, you're working with somebody and you actively listen and you learn that they're really egotistical, and they need, in their mind, they need to be the most important person in the room, and they need everybody else to know that they're the most important person in the room. Knowing that can be great, valuable, powerful information for you. You have to do the active listening to know that, though. Combine that with your goal and say, okay, I just want to get away from this person. All right, now that I know that they need their ego to be important, and I know I just need to wrap this up because I got to get on to a next project, I can now start making choices. So here's a practical suggestion then for somebody, if, let's say, they were somebody who was maybe narcissistic, and they needed to be the most important person, and your goal was just to survive the interaction. Knowing that can then allow us to make really specific communication choices, like gray rocking. So gray rocking is a specific type of communication response where we just don't give the other person much to work with. So if you have a colleague or a customer or even a boss who's trying to pick a fight, or is just really trying to get you looped into a conversation you don't want to be a part of, then you can gray rock, which is kind of like acting like you're just a gray rock sitting out in the world. You can't interact much with a gray rock. So when somebody starts the conversation with you or tries to really egg you on, you can say something like, okay, okay, I hear you. And you can just let the pause do all the rest of the work. The person's not going to love it. But if you know a little bit about their intentions and you know what your goals are, then you can make choices about your communication tactics that can help you survive or make the most out of that difficult and unfortunately all too common interaction.
Gray rocking was one of the ones I took from your session that I circled 3 times because I love that. And I think you also made the point of like, we all only have so much energy to give in the day. So when you're wasting time with someone that's like not putting a lot of value, or, to limit that's why gray rocking is so important, is because you're doing both. You're reserving your energy for yourself, but you're not giving your energy into gossip or whatever it may be that's so draining. And the other question I want to ask of something you said earlier, what about those who might be saying, Dr. Stephen Lynn, that's great, but I don't want to, let's give the ego example of the person who just wants their ego. They want to, in a room. So then you kind of give them what they want. But what about those who are just saying, I don't want to do that, right? Like this person just ruffles my feathers and they're so egotistical. Everyone else should see that. What do you say to those people in those situations?
That is a great question and really requires us to know what our goals are in the moment. If you're in a meeting and you have somebody else in the meeting who is just so frustrating, and this sense of justice in you says they should not get the microphone for this long, the spotlight should not be on them, they are not that important. Well, sometimes you have to make the tough choice and say, yeah, cosmic justice says that I should stand up for the world and put them in their place. But if in reality, I just want to get out of this meeting, or I want to raise, or I know they're in a position of power, well, then if we're being strategic as professionals, then sometimes we just have to let people write their own fate, let them write their own story. And oftentimes, justice will be served in its own way. Or it might be the case where you say, no, I'm in competition with them. It's not a matter of cosmic justice. It's a matter of they keep stealing the attention when I am competing for the same resources. In that scenario, you might then, knowing that that's your goal, you might need to employ some tactics where you make sure that when you start speaking, you don't stop speaking if they start talking over you. Or you might make sure to say out loud some of their ideas that are flawed so that the whole room doesn't just tacitly go along with the loud person, but you put on the table, all right, I want to make sure we're all understanding that this is our plan moving forward, so that you can start to steal some of that attention back if your goal is that specific goal. Knowing your goal is really critical to dealing with that person. Sometimes we just have to go decompress and have a friend outside of work we can complain to.
You've mentioned that multiple times, and I think it's such a great point, is being strategic. In the sense of communication, is it simply zooming out, knowing what you want, and delivering those efforts strategically? Like when you say strategic, can you compare and contrast strategic communication versus maybe tactical or non-strategic communication?
Yeah, I often approach this with entrepreneurs that I work with. So one of the types of clients that I work with is often entrepreneurs who are developing businesses and they're trying to pitch their ideas to investors. They often have the core reason why they are doing the thing they're doing, why they made their product or service. And that's usually what they want to talk about because it's near and dear to their heart. It's the thing that keeps them up at night, it's the thing that keeps them motivated. That might be the instinctual, habitual, first round idea of what you want to say. It's not always the most strategic. If we're thinking through what I want out of this situation, we might say, oh, maybe I'm in this business because it's really great for the environment, but maybe this investor I'm talking to does not have a history of making investments based upon environmental standards. So, as tough as it is and as less fun as it can be in the moment, maybe I shouldn't talk about the way that is the knee-jerk reaction for me. Maybe I shouldn't talk about my business only as an environmental business, for example. Maybe I should talk about it from its return on investment. And the same thing happens in micro moments in the boardroom too, where our first instinct of what we want to say might not get us closer to our goals. Strategic communication is the style of communication where you say, this is what I want. These are the options I have. Which one's most likely to get there? And if I don't love it, I can work on that. Or maybe I can go back to the options and say, all right, I don't love that path. Maybe it doesn't fit me in my persona or my ethics. So let's think about what the other paths are, but we're going to be purposeful about thinking through those options. And the great thing is that the more and more you do that, the more and more it becomes muscle memory. So you are able to be strategic in a quicker fashion later on.
No, I love that. It's great points. Dr. Stephen Lenz, a couple final questions for you. Outside of teaching, writing, all the things that you do from a professional hat standpoint, kind of what do you do on the other side personally when you're not working, so to speak?
I love being in LA because the hiking scene, like it seems it's maybe cliche to say I like going hiking in LA, but I really do. And my dog and I are big fans of going out there in the world and enjoying being present and getting away and bumping into other folks. We had our first coyote encounter this last week, so I know, right? We survived, so we will survive to hike again for sure.
Yeah, me and you share that as far as hiking, and we went to, me and my wife and our kids. I have 4 kids. We're trying to get out there. It's kind of hard to move with 4, but I mean, there's something just so resetting about being in nature that's, like it's addictive to some point and good on a personal level. I've gotten the sense that you like comic books. I think you said Comic-Con is his past story, the 12-year-old moment of that comic book. So I got to ask you, what's your absolute favorite superhero or comic book?
It really is the one in which I had that fan letter published, Spider-Man 2099, and this is not a setup. It's literally on the bookshelf behind me. This is the issue. I keep it there because not only is it a fun reminder of that moment in life, but also I just really enjoyed this particular run. But I had this horrible moment where as a child, I referred to it as Spider-Man 2099. We weren't in the 2000s yet, so I didn't know how we were going to say it. And then later in life, I tweeted at the creator of this series and said, was it 2099 or 2099? And he wrote back and said, to me, it was always 2099. And the heartbreak, because I had said it wrong. But yeah, it's the Spider-Man 2099 top favorite.
And why Spider-Man over Superman or Batman or any of the other ones? What about Spider-Man in particular?
I mean, I do love a good Superman story. That is very much true as well. There's an optimism in Superman that is just really, really, I think, important. Spider-Man is a really powerful character, and in most metrics, the most financially successful of all the superhero characters. And I think it's for good reason that there is something about the character that says anybody can be Spider-Man, that there is a level of chance, but also just a realness, a groundedness to this fantastical character that makes him a really, really likable character with a big invitation to insert yourself into the story and to imagine that you're swinging from building to building as well, that if you just allow yourself to be in the right place at the right time and then give yourself permission to put on the mask, that you too could be a superhero. And that's a really fun place to go with your imagination.
Oh, for sure. And there's as I said, I have young kids. They like the new Disney Junior series that's out there, and it's a jam, not gonna lie. I think the intro's by Fall Out Boy. It's good.
I have tiny little nephews. My tiny little nephews love it as well, and I fully support that life choice. Plus, you become a more successful person, you become a more well-rounded person if you allow your imagination to grow and to explore new ideas. And I'm actually really grateful that I grew up in the kind of really rich comic book era, because I think it really seeded a type of curiosity that I'm just really, really thankful for.
Yeah, for sure. I could relate there too. I had a big stack of comic books when I was a younger kid and just got lost in my own world and would sometimes make my own comics. And looking back, they were so bad, but but it was a creative outlet. So my next question was going to be, around creative outlets, but maybe more, is there a morning or evening routine that helps you that you would recommend to others?
I have uh, coffee with my dog every morning. I mean, he doesn't have coffee, but I do. And there is like I'm not a coffee snob, but I want to be. Like I want to know all of the things about coffee. I really enjoy having a particular moment of unimportant, like career unimportant interest that is just mine with the dog in the morning. I mean, like, yeah, sure, millions of people love coffee. Yes, absolutely. But for me in the morning, it's just something that I like. It's not me checking my email. It's not me updating my LinkedIn. It's just me doing something that I like in the morning with my dog who has this, like, eternal love as dogs do. And I really suggest that as a daily practice of finding a moment that is just about something you like. And it does not have a practical, for as much as everything else I've said, does not have a practical strategic purpose behind it, but is just you being and just allowing yourself to be in a way that just brings you joy. Full stop. For me, that's coffee with the dog in the morning. For other people, it's all sorts of things.
I love it. How long is that coffee with the dog session?
Well, the first session is usually about 15 minutes, and then about 45 minutes later, we go in for round two.
There you go. There you go. Dr. Stephen Lin, thank you for taking the time. I'm going to get you out of here on the final question we ask everybody. And thank you once again. This has been very insightful. All your talk around communication, anxiety, I think a lot of people can relate out there and have some practical tools and tips that they can use by listening to this conversation. But the final question we always ask is trying to, just like you are as a teacher, try and provide advice out there that can help others. Maybe they take one nugget, two nuggets, and they could provide to their lives or careers. So if you were to provide 3 tips on how someone, no matter what their position is, if they want to take their career to the next level, what would those 3 tips be from you?
The first suggestion is maybe the hardest one, and that is to allow yourself to be vulnerable, to give yourself that permission to open yourself up to new experiences that are going to be uncomfortable, to feedback that might be valuable but isn't going to be fun to have. A level of vulnerability is really so critical. And for folks who haven't watched Brene Brown's TED Talk on vulnerability, it's such a great starting place to thinking through what it means to grow in vulnerability. The second suggestion I would have would be to explore. If you want to grow your career, or if you want to make a shift in your career, maybe you want to pivot, exploration is so important because, quite frankly, I had no clue that business communication, or even being a business communication professor in a business school in LA, I didn't even know that was an option for a good chunk of my life. And it was through moments of accidental and purposeful exploration that made me say, oh, wow, that's a thing I can do. Exploration, whether it's shadowing or following somebody on social media or just chatting with people who do cool things that are interesting to you, is really, really powerful. And then finally, I would suggest that for folks who want to improve in or advance or grow your career, you need to remember that your career path is your career path. When I had finished my master's degree and was getting so many no's, I was keeping track of them. And when I got to 75 no's in the mail, I stopped counting. And it was a challenging moment because I thought that I was supposed to be doing something different. I was supposed to be somewhere that I wasn't yet because my colleagues were there. Your career path is your career path. And that's what's exciting about it. So while you can take inspiration and you can learn lessons from others, ultimately, you have to be happy and you have to be settled in the fact that your story is unique. And that's kind of beautiful.
Well said. Those are awesome 3 tips: vulnerability, exploration, and your career path is your career path. Dr. Stephen Lin, thanks again for taking the time. Truly appreciate it. And maybe we can do it again sometime.
Absolutely. Totally my pleasure.
All right. Have a good day.
You too.
Check out more episodes on nextlevelcasinocareers.com.